Black businessman denied business class seat. Few moments later, the flight attendant bows to him. The plane's cabin fell silent as the flight attendant, with trembling hands, bent at the waist and bowed deeply in front of Mr. Henry Carter. A few moments earlier, the same man had been dismissed from his reserved seat in business class, told he didn't belong. Now every eye in the cabin was on them, the collective shock palpable in the air. Whispers spread like wildfire among the passengers. Why was she bowing? What had changed so drastically in mere minutes? The stunned looks on everyone's faces mirrored the questions racing through their minds. Henry sat still, his sharp eyes fixed on the attendant, who looked as though she wanted to disappear. Before she could straighten herself, another man hurried down the aisle toward Henry, his face pale and his steps hurried. The pilot had entered the cabin, his authoritative presence adding to the weight of the moment. But how had things escalated to this point? It all started earlier that day when Henry arrived at the airport for a business trip to Atlanta. Dressed in a crisp navy suit and carrying a sleek leather briefcase, he made his way to the check-in counter. Henry, a successful entrepreneur, had built his company from the ground up. He was no stranger to business class travel. Today, he was running slightly behind schedule due to traffic, but he kept calm and focused. At the check-in counter, the agent, a middle-aged man named Joe, smiled and processed Henry's boarding pass without issue. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Carter," he said with genuine warmth. Henry appreciated the small kindness and hurried to security. Once through the TSA line, he made his way to the gate. He noticed some stares as he walked through the terminal, a mixture of curiosity, disdain, and indifference. He was used to it. As a black man in predominantly white spaces, it wasn't unfamiliar territory. He brushed it off and approached the boarding gate. After waiting for his boarding group to be called, Henry stepped forward when they announced business class. He handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, who scanned it without hesitation. As Henry stepped onto the jet bridge, he overheard a quiet voice muttering behind him. "Figures. Must be in the wrong place." The comment stung, but Henry didn't react. Years of experience had taught him to pick his battles wisely. He found his seat -4A, a window seat, and settled in. Minutes passed as the plane filled. A blonde-haired flight attendant in her early 30s appeared in the aisle, performing routine checks. Her name tag read Samantha. When she reached Henry's row, her gaze lingered on him. Her cheerful smile faded into something more cautious. "Sir, may I see your ticket, please?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Henry raised an eyebrow. "Of course." He handed her the boarding pass. Samantha scanned the document quickly, then frowned. "Sir, this is a business class ticket." "Yes, it is," Henry replied evenly, not moving from his seat. She glanced down at the ticket again, then back at him, her expression hardening. "Are you sure this is your seat? Perhaps you meant to sit in economy." The words hung in the air, sharp and humiliating. Nearby passengers began to glance in their direction, their curiosity turning into open gawking. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Henry said calmly, his voice steady but firm. "Now, if there's nothing else, I'd like to prepare for the flight." Samantha pursed her lips. "I'll need to check with the gate agent. Please remain here." Henry leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. He refused to let the situation rattle him. Moments later, Samantha returned with another attendant in tow, this one older and more senior in appearance. Samantha whispered something to her, then handed her the boarding pass. The senior attendant, whose name tag read Lisa, reviewed it carefully. "It's all in order," Lisa finally said, handing the ticket back to Samantha. "He's seated correctly." But Samantha didn't back down. "There's no way. I've been working this route for months. This doesn't happen. This doesn't happen." Henry repeated, his voice tinged with incredulity. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Samantha's face reddened and she quickly turned away. Henry could feel the stares growing heavier. He glanced around the cabin, noticing a mix of uncomfortable silence and judgmental gazes. The flight continued boarding, and eventually the commotion seemed to die down. Henry thought the ordeal was over, until it escalated further. Moments before takeoff, Samantha returned with the co-pilot. "We've reviewed your ticket again, sir," Samantha began. "There seems to be a mistake." Henry's jaw tightened. "There's no mistake. I've flown this airline countless times. My ticket was issued and confirmed. Are you asking me to leave my seat?" "I'm asking you to cooperate," she said, her voice strained but insistent. Henry stood, towering over her. "And I'm asking you to stop assuming that I don't belong here because of the color of my skin." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Samantha flinched as if struck. Before she could respond, the co-pilot stepped in. "Sir, please remain calm." "I am calm," Henry replied, "but I won't tolerate this treatment. Get your captain or someone who actually has authority." Minutes passed in tense silence. Henry remained standing, his gaze locked on Samantha. The senior flight attendant, Lisa, eventually returned with the captain, a tall man in his late 40s. His expression was grave. "Mr. Carter, I apologize for the inconvenience," he said, his tone measured. "There's been a misunderstanding. Please take your seat." Henry sat down slowly, his eyes never leaving Samantha. The captain pulled her aside, and their hushed conversation was heated but inaudible. The plane finally prepared for takeoff, but the story didn't end there. Just as the plane reached cruising altitude, Samantha reappeared, her face pale and drawn. She stood in the aisle, visibly nervous. Then, to everyone's shock, she bowed. Henry's lips pressed into a thin line as the whispers grew louder around him, and then the captain entered the cabin. "What are they doing now?" a man behind him muttered. Henry's heartbeat remained steady as he prepared for whatever came next. The cabin was thick with tension as the captain walked toward Henry. Samantha remained frozen in her bow, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Passengers exchanged bewildered glances, some leaning into the aisle to get a better view. The hum of the engines was the only sound cutting through the uneasy silence. The captain stopped beside Samantha, his face a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice calm but with a hint of urgency, "may I have a word with you privately?" Henry looked at him, then at Samantha, who still hadn't moved. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the cabin pressing down on him. "Is there something that can't be said here, Captain?" His tone was measured, his expression unreadable. The captain hesitated, clearly unprepared for the question. "I believe it would be better to discuss this away from the passengers." Henry considered this for a moment before uncrossing his legs and standing. His tall frame commanded attention, and the murmurs in the cabin grew louder. "Lead the way," he said. The captain motioned for him to follow, and they walked to the front of the plane, disappearing into the galley near the cockpit. The door shut behind them, and the whispers in the cabin reached a crescendo. In the galley, the captain faced Henry, his expression apologetic. "Mr. Carter, I owe you a personal apology on behalf of the airline. What happened earlier was unacceptable. Samantha acted out of line, and her behavior does not reflect the values of our crew or this company." Henry crossed his arms, his sharp gaze unrelenting. "I don't need platitudes, Captain. I need an explanation. Why was I singled out, humiliated in front of the entire cabin, and made to feel like an intruder in the seat I paid for?" The captain ran a hand through his graying hair. "You're absolutely right to demand answers, and I won't make excuses. What I can tell you is that Samantha acted on her own prejudices. We will be addressing this matter with her directly." "That's not enough," Henry said, his voice firm but not raised. "If you think an apology will erase what happened, you're mistaken. I didn't just endure this for myself. I endured it for every person who has ever been treated this way and didn't have the means or the voice to fight back." The captain nodded, clearly uncomfortable under Henry's unwavering stare. "I understand, Mr. Carter. We will ensure this doesn't happen again." Henry leaned in slightly, his presence imposing. "I'll hold you to that." The conversation ended there, and Henry returned to his seat, his head held high. The cabin fell silent again as he passed, passengers avoiding his gaze. Samantha was nowhere to be seen. The flight continued uneventfully for the next hour, and Henry tried to focus on the presentation he was preparing for his meeting in Atlanta. He opened his laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating his face. He had spent years perfecting his pitch, and this upcoming deal was a major milestone for his company. Still, the events earlier kept replaying in his mind, each detail sharper than the last. The quiet hum of the engines was interrupted by Lisa, the senior flight attendant, who approached Henry's seat with a tray. She placed a glass of champagne and a small plate of hors d'oeuvres on the table in front of him. "Mr. Carter, compliments of the captain," she said softly. Henry looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said, though his voice carried no warmth. Lisa nodded and stepped away, leaving him to his thoughts. He barely touched the offerings. Instead, he leaned back and closed his eyes, willing the tension in his chest to dissipate. An hour later, just as the plane began its descent into Atlanta, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Atlanta. We'd like to thank you for flying with us today and wish you a pleasant stay." Henry prepared for landing, closing his laptop and fastening his seatbelt. As the wheels touched the runway and the plane taxied to the gate, he couldn't shake the feeling that the day's events weren't quite over. When the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began gathering their belongings. Henry waited, letting the crowd thin out before standing. As he reached for his briefcase in the overhead compartment, he noticed Samantha standing at the front of the cabin, her head bowed slightly. Henry grabbed his things and walked toward the exit, his posture confident but reserved. As he passed Samantha, she looked up, her face pale. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry." Henry paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. He turned to her, his expression calm but piercing. "You're sorry now," he said. "But the damage is done." He stepped off the plane, the weight of her apology lingering in the air. The terminal was bustling with travelers, and Henry moved swiftly toward the exit. As he walked, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a notification from his assistant, Amanda. "Amanda, call me when you land. We have a situation." Henry frowned, his pace quickening. What could possibly be waiting for him now? His phone buzzed again, this time with a call. It was Amanda. He answered. "Amanda, I just landed. What's going on?" Her voice was hurried and tense. "You need to check social media, Mr. Carter. Someone recorded the whole thing on the plane. It's everywhere." Henry stopped in his tracks, the noise of the terminal fading into the background. "What do you mean, everywhere?" "Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, you name it. The video's gone viral. Everyone's talking about it." Henry sighed deeply. He had barely stepped off the plane, and the storm was already brewing. "What are they saying?" he asked. "It's a mixed bag," Amanda replied. "Some people are on your side, calling out the airline and demanding accountability. Others, well, you can imagine." Henry closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. He had dealt with public scrutiny before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something much bigger. "Amanda, schedule a press conference," he said, his voice steady. "And make sure the legal team is ready. This isn't over." Henry stood outside the terminal, the cool Atlanta breeze brushing against his face as he dialed Amanda's number again. The gravity of the situation was beginning to settle in. His private humiliation on the plane was now a public spectacle, and he knew this wasn't going to disappear quietly. "Amanda," he said as soon as she picked up, "I'm heading to the office now. I want every detail of this social media fallout on my desk by the time I arrive. Also, connect with the airline's corporate office. I want a direct response from them." "Yes, Mr. Carter," Amanda said. "But there's one more thing you need to know." Henry tightened his grip on his phone. "What is it?" "There's another video," she said hesitantly. "It's from after you left the plane. Someone caught the flight attendant, Samantha, talking to another passenger. She wasn't exactly kind." "What did she say?" She claimed you were probably trying to make a scene for attention, and that people like him are always looking for a reason to play the victim. The words hit Henry like a blow. He clenched his jaw, his anger simmering just below the surface. "Send me that video. I want to see it for myself." "I'm on it," Amanda said. "See you at the office." Henry hung up and hailed a cab, his thoughts racing. As the car weaved through traffic, he opened his email to find the video Amanda had mentioned. He watched it in silence, his face hardening with every word Samantha spoke. The public fallout was going to be bigger than he'd imagined. By the time Henry arrived at his office, his team was already in full crisis mode. Amanda met him at the elevator, holding a tablet filled with updates. "Here's where we stand," she began as they walked toward his office. "The original video has over 3 million views and counting. It's trending on every major platform. Hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #JusticeForHenryCarter are all over Twitter. Celebrities are starting to chime in too." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Celebrities?" "Yeah, a few high-profile names are backing you up. Gabrielle Union, Viola Davis, and even LeBron James have tweeted about it. They're calling for a boycott of the airline." Henry nodded, processing the information. "And what about the airline? Have they said anything?" "They issued a generic statement about being committed to diversity and inclusion," Amanda said, rolling her eyes. "But they haven't addressed you directly. People are already calling it a PR disaster." Henry sat down at his desk, his mind racing with the possibilities. This wasn't just a personal battle anymore. It was an opportunity to shine a light on a systemic issue that had plagued countless others. "Amanda," he said, his tone decisive, "we're going to respond, but not just for me. We're going to make this about the bigger picture." Amanda nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "What's the plan?" "First," Henry said, "schedule that press conference for tomorrow morning. I want it broadcast live. Second, I want a detailed report on every incident like this that's been reported against this airline in the past 5 years. And third," he paused, his gaze steely, "get me a meeting with their CEO." Amanda's eyes widened. "You're going straight to the top." "That's where the real change happens," Henry said. "And I'm not stopping until I get it." The rest of the day was a blur of meetings, phone calls, and media coordination. Henry's team worked tirelessly to craft a statement that would resonate. By the evening, the press conference was set, and the media buzz was only growing louder. As Henry prepared to leave the office, his phone buzzed again. It was a text from an unknown number. "Unknown. Mr. Carter, this is Lisa, the senior flight attendant from your flight. I need to speak with you. It's important." Henry stared at the message, his instincts telling him this could be a turning point. He replied with a time and location to meet. Whatever Lisa had to say, he needed to hear it. Lisa arrived at the coffee shop exactly on time, her expression tense and her hands clasped tightly around her bag. She spotted Henry at a corner table and approached cautiously. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she sat down. Henry nodded. "I'm here because I believe you have something worth sharing." "What is it?" Lisa glanced around the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. She leaned in and lowered her voice. "What happened on that flight was wrong. But there's more to it than you know." Henry tilted his head, intrigued. "Go on." "Samantha has a history," Lisa said. "She's been reported by other passengers before for similar behavior. Management knows, but they've always swept it under the rug. She's connected." "Connected?" Henry asked, narrowing his eyes. "Her uncle is one of the airline's senior executives," Lisa admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's been protected for years." Henry leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "So they've allowed this to continue because of nepotism?" Lisa nodded, her face filled with guilt. "I've wanted to speak out for a long time, but I didn't have the courage. Seeing what happened to you pushed me over the edge." Henry studied her for a moment, gauging her sincerity. "Thank you for telling me this," he said. "But if we're going to expose the truth, I need you to come forward publicly." Lisa's eyes widened. Publicly? I don't know if I can do that. You've already taken the first step by coming here, Henry said gently. But if you stay silent, they'll keep getting away with it. You have the power to make a difference. Lisa looked down at her hands, her internal struggle evident. Finally, she nodded. Okay, I'll do it. Henry extended his hand across the table, and she shook it firmly. You're doing the right thing, Lisa. Together, we'll make sure they're held accountable. As they left the coffee shop, Henry's phone buzzed again. This time it was another text, this one from Amanda. Amanda, the airline just released a new statement. They're claiming you were disruptive on the flight. They're trying to flip the narrative. Henry read the message twice, his anger building. So that's how they want to play it, he muttered to himself. Lisa glanced at him, her expression concerned. What's wrong? They're doubling down, Henry said, his voice filled with resolve. But they just made the biggest mistake of all. The battle was far from over, and Henry was more determined than ever to win. Henry sat in his office, staring at the airline's latest statement plastered across every major news outlet. The bold headline read, Passengers' disruptive behavior escalated incident on board. The article painted a picture of a belligerent traveler whose actions had necessitated intervention for the safety and comfort of all passengers. It was a blatant attempt to discredit him, and Henry could feel the fury boiling in his chest. Amanda burst into the room, tablet in hand. They're gaslighting the entire situation, she said, pacing. The public is split. Some believe their statement, but others are calling them out. Social media is a war zone right now. Henry looked at her, his expression calm but deadly serious. Then it's time to escalate. Is the press conference still set for tomorrow morning? Yes, Amanda said, placing the tablet on his desk. We've confirmed coverage from all major networks, but if we're going to counter this narrative, we need something stronger. We already have it, Henry replied, leaning back in his chair. Lisa is ready to come forward. Her testimony about Samantha's history and the airline's cover-up will tip the scales. Amanda's eyes lit up. You're serious? She's willing to go public. She's nervous, but she knows it's the right thing to do, Henry said. Make sure she's prepped for the conference. I want her protected, Amanda. No one is going to bully her into silence again. Amanda nodded firmly. You've got it. And one more thing, some legal analysts are suggesting you should file a lawsuit. The public loves a fight, and it'll keep the pressure on the airline. Henry rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Not yet. Let's see how they respond after tomorrow. If they double down again, we'll hit them where it hurts. The next morning, the press conference room was packed. Journalists, cameras, and microphones filled the space as murmurs rippled through the crowd. Henry stood behind the podium, calm and composed, his sharp suit and commanding presence drawing every eye in the room. Beside him stood Lisa, visibly nervous but resolute. Amanda had worked with her late into the night to prepare her statement, and now she clutched a copy of it in her hands. Henry began, his voice steady but firm. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I want to address the events that occurred during my recent flight and the broader implications of what happened. He paused, scanning the room. This isn't just about me. This is about a culture of discrimination that has gone unchecked for far too long. It's about accountability. Accountability for those who perpetuate prejudice and for those who enable it. The room was silent, every reporter hanging on his words. I want to introduce someone who has courageously decided to speak out. Henry continued, gesturing to Lisa. This is Lisa, a senior flight attendant who has first-hand knowledge of the airline's practices. Lisa, the floor is yours. Lisa stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. Thank you, Mr. Carter, she began. I've worked for this airline for over 10 years. During that time, I've seen behavior that goes against everything we're supposed to stand for. What happened to Mr. Carter on that flight was not an isolated incident. She took a deep breath. Samantha, the flight attendant involved, has a documented history of treating passengers unfairly, particularly passengers of color. Complaints have been filed against her multiple times, but they were ignored. She was protected because of her connections within the company. Gasps rippled through the room and reporters began furiously scribbling notes. "I'm ashamed to say that I didn't speak up sooner," Lisa continued, her voice breaking slightly. "But I'm speaking up now because it's the right thing to do. This airline needs to change, and it starts with holding people accountable." Henry stepped back to the podium as the room erupted with questions. "Mr. Carter, Mr. Carter," one reporter shouted, "do you plan to file a lawsuit against the airline?" Henry held up a hand to quiet the crowd. "I'm not here to announce legal action yet. I'm here to demand transparency and systemic change. The airline must address not only what happened to me, but the broader culture that allows incidents like this to occur." "Mr. Carter," another reporter called out, "how do you respond to the airline's claim that you were disruptive?" Henry's eyes hardened. Their claim is a blatant lie, and the video evidence proves it. Their attempt to smear me is an insult, not just to me, but to every person who has ever been silenced or ignored when speaking out against injustice. The room burst into applause, a rare occurrence in such settings. Henry stood firm, his resolve unshaken. By the end of the day, the press conference was the top story on every news outlet. The hashtag Justice for Henry Carter had reached over 10 million tweets, and public figures from all walks of life were rallying behind him. Meanwhile, in the airline's corporate offices, chaos reigned. Executives scrambled to control the narrative, their PR team working overtime. But it wasn't enough. Late that evening, Amanda burst into Henry's office with breaking news. "They just issued another statement," she said, handing him her phone. Henry read the message, a slow smile spreading across his face. The airline had announced that Samantha was being placed on immediate suspension pending an internal investigation. They also promised a full review of their policies and practices. "They're cracking under the pressure," Amanda said, grinning. "You're winning." Henry set the phone down, his expression resolute. "This is just the beginning. They can suspend one person, but until they address the system that allowed her behavior to thrive, this fight isn't over." He leaned back in his chair, already planning his next move. The storm was far from over, but Henry Carter was prepared to weather it and win. The morning after the airline statement, Henry sat in his office reviewing the latest updates with Amanda. Though the suspension of Samantha was a step forward, Henry knew it was a calculated move to placate the public without addressing the root of the issue. His phone buzzed on the desk, a text from his legal counsel, Elijah Green. "Elijah, we need to talk. There's more to this than we thought." Henry immediately called him. Elijah didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Henry, I've been digging into this airline's records. They've settled at least 3 racial discrimination cases in the last 5 years, all quietly. NDAs were signed, so details are scarce, but the patterns are clear." Henry's grip on the phone tightened. "And Samantha? Is her name tied to any of these cases?" "That's the thing," Elijah said. "Her name doesn't appear in the settlements, but her name does come up in internal employee complaints. Multiple times." Henry leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "How do we use this?" "We use it to build leverage," Elijah said. "If this goes to court, those settlements and internal complaints will be part of the discovery process. It's going to force their hand." Henry paused, considering his next move. "Let's keep this information close for now. I want them to make the next mistake. Once they do, we'll have everything we need to expose them completely." That evening, Henry sat at home, replaying the events of the past few days in his mind. The public support was overwhelming, but it also came with backlash. His social media accounts were flooded with both messages of solidarity and vitriol. He had learned to tune out the noise, but tonight, one comment caught his eye. It was a private message from a former airline employee named Marcus. "Marcus, Mr. Carter, I saw your press conference. I used to work for that airline, and what Lisa said is true. It's worse than you know. If you're willing to listen, I have information that could help your case." Henry immediately replied, setting up a call. Within minutes, Marcus's voice came through the line, low and cautious. "Thank you for reaching out," Henry said. "What do you have for me?" "I worked in HR for 5 years," Marcus began. "I left because I couldn't stand what I was seeing anymore. Complaints about racial discrimination were swept under the rug. Employees were told not to document incidents, especially if they involved higher-ups or people with connections." Henry's jaw clenched. "And Samantha?" Marcus sighed. "Her uncle is Mark Dempsey, one of the senior executives. Everyone knew she was untouchable. She could do whatever she wanted, and if anyone reported her, they were the ones who got reprimanded." "Do you have proof of this?" Henry asked. Marcus hesitated. "I don't have the official documents. Those stayed with the company. But I do have emails. I forwarded some to my personal account before I left, just in case. They show discussions about covering up complaints and shielding certain employees." Henry's pulse quickened. "Marcus, what you have could change everything. Are you willing to come forward?" "I don't know," Marcus said, his voice tinged with fear. "I signed an NDA when I left. If I break it, they'll come after me." "I understand your hesitation," Henry said. "But this isn't just about me. It's about exposing a system that's hurting people. If you're willing, my legal team will protect you." There was a long pause before Marcus finally spoke. "Let me think about it. I'll get back to you soon." The next day, as Henry prepared for another round of media interviews, Amanda rushed into his office, her face pale. "You're not going to believe this," she said, handing him her tablet. On the screen was an article from a major news outlet. The headline read, "Airline employee breaks silence, claims racial discrimination culture runs deep." Henry skimmed the article, his eyes widening. The piece featured an anonymous former employee detailing the same things Marcus had told him: cover-ups, NDAs, and preferential treatment for connected employees. The article cited internal emails obtained by the whistleblower. Henry's phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "I didn't want to blindside you," Marcus said as soon as Henry answered. "But I couldn't wait anymore. I sent the emails to a reporter I trust. They're out now." Henry exhaled, a mixture of relief and urgency washing over him. "You did the right thing, Marcus. This changes everything." "Do you think it'll be enough?" Marcus asked. "It's a start," Henry said. "But the fight isn't over." As the day unfolded, the fallout from the article was immediate. News outlets picked up the story, and public outrage against the airline reached a fever pitch. Social media was flooded with calls for boycotts, and stock prices for the airline began to dip. By late afternoon, Amanda received a call from the airline's corporate office. She put the call on speaker in Henry's office. "This is Martin Pierce, head of corporate communications," the voice said. "We'd like to arrange a meeting with Mr. Carter to discuss a resolution." Henry leaned forward. "If they're calling now, they're desperate," he said quietly to Amanda before speaking into the phone. "I'm willing to meet, but let's be clear. This isn't just about me. I won't settle for anything less than systemic change." "Understood," Pierce replied, his voice tense. "We'll set up a meeting for tomorrow." As the call ended, Amanda looked at Henry, her expression serious. "Do you trust them?" "Not at all," Henry said. "But I'm not walking into that room alone. Schedule the meeting and get a ledger on the line. This is the opening we've been waiting for." The next day, Henry arrived at the airline's headquarters with Elijah by his side. The building was sleek and imposing, a symbol of corporate power. But Henry wasn't intimidated. They were ushered into a large conference room where several executives, including Mark Dempsey, were waiting. The atmosphere was tense as they exchanged perfunctory greetings and took their seats. Pierce began. "Mr. Carter, we want to apologize again for the incident on your flight. We understand the impact this has had, and we're committed to making things right." Henry's expression remained neutral. "Words are meaningless without action. What exactly are you offering?" Pierce glanced at Dempsey before continuing. "We're prepared to issue a formal public apology and make a donation to a racial justice organization of your choice. Additionally, we're launching a review of our diversity and inclusion policies." Henry didn't flinch. That's a start, but it's not enough. What about Samantha? What about the systemic issues that allowed her behavior to go unchecked? Pierce hesitated, but Dempsey spoke up. Mr. Carter, we're handling those matters internally. We assure you. Henry cut him off. Internal processes are what allowed this culture to thrive. I want transparency. I want an independent investigation, not just into Samantha, but into your entire organization. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Elijah leaned forward. And if you don't comply, we'll pursue legal action. The whistleblower's emails have already painted a damning picture. Do you really want this going to court? The room fell silent, the weight of Elijah's words sinking in. Finally, Pierce nodded. We'll take your demands under advisement and respond by the end of the week. Henry stood, his presence commanding. You have 2 days. After that, I take this fight to the public again. As he and Elijah left the room, Henry felt a surge of determination. The airline was on the ropes, but the fight was far from over. 2 days felt like an eternity as Henry waited for the airline's response. The tension was palpable in his office, where Amanda and Elijah had set up a makeshift war room to manage the growing media frenzy. Each day brought new developments. More former employees came forward, more damaging stories surfaced, and public support for Henry continued to grow. By midday on the second day, Amanda's phone buzzed with an email notification. She read the message, her brow furrowing. It's from the airline, she said, looking up at Henry. They're requesting another meeting. They want it to be private, with no media involvement. Henry leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. They're trying to control the narrative, he said. They know they've already lost in the court of public opinion, so they're hoping to minimize further damage. Amanda nodded. Should we agree? Henry glanced at Elijah, who was reviewing the legal implications. It's worth hearing what they have to say, Elijah said. But we dictate the terms this time. No more empty promises or half measures. Henry stood, adjusting his jacket. Set the meeting. Let's see if they're finally ready to take responsibility. The next morning, Henry arrived at the airline's headquarters once again, this time accompanied by both Elijah and Amanda. The tension in the air was even thicker than before. They were escorted into the same conference room, where the airline CEO, William Grayson, was waiting along with several other executives, including Mark Dempsey. Grayson stood to greet them, his demeanor polite but guarded. Mr. Carter, thank you for agreeing to meet with us again. We understand the situation has escalated significantly, and we're committed to finding a resolution that satisfies all parties. Henry didn't sit immediately. Instead, he placed his hands on the back of the chair and stared directly at Grayson. Let's skip the formalities, Mr. Grayson. You've had 2 days to come up with a plan. What are you offering? Grayson motioned for everyone to sit. Once they were settled, he began. First, we're prepared to issue a public apology that directly acknowledges the systemic failures within our organization. We'll also terminate Samantha's employment immediately and ensure that any similar incidents are thoroughly investigated moving forward. Henry's expression didn't change. And what about the deeper issues? Your culture of protecting employees like Samantha and silencing those who speak out. Grayson hesitated, glancing at Dempsey, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We'll conduct a comprehensive review of our internal policies and engage a third-party consultant to oversee reforms. That's not enough, Elijah interjected. A review and a consultant aren't going to cut it. We need an independent investigation with full transparency, and the findings must be made public. Grayson's jaw tightened. That's a big ask, Mr. Green. We're willing to cooperate, but airing our internal issues publicly could damage the company. Henry leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Grayson's. Your company is already damaged. The only way to rebuild trust is to show the public that you're willing to clean house, no matter the cost. There was a long silence as the executives exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, Grayson spoke. We'll agree to an independent investigation, but the terms must be negotiated. We're also prepared to make a significant donation to organizations dedicated to fighting racial discrimination. Henry didn't flinch. How significant? Grayson named a figure. A generous amount, but not enough to make a lasting impact. Henry shook his head. Double it. And I want a seat on the advisory board overseeing the reforms. If you're serious about change, you'll include voices like mine in the process. The room fell silent again, the weight of Henry's demands settling over the table. Grayson leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of reluctant acceptance. You drive a hard bargain, Mr. Carter. But under the circumstances, I don't see that we have a choice. By the end of the meeting, the framework for the agreement was in place. The airline would issue a public apology, terminate Samantha, and launch an independent investigation. Henry's involvement in the advisory board was a groundbreaking move that sent a clear message. Change was coming. As they left the headquarters, Amanda turned to Henry, her eyes shining with pride. You did it, she said. You forced their hand. Henry nodded, though his expression remained serious. This is just the beginning, Amanda. Agreements are one thing, but action is another. We'll hold them accountable every step of the way. That evening, the airline released its apology. It was direct and unflinching, acknowledging the systemic issues that had allowed discrimination to persist within their organization. The public response was swift and overwhelmingly positive, with many praising Henry's determination and leadership. But not everyone was satisfied. Samantha's termination sparked outrage from a small but vocal group who claimed she was being made a scapegoat. One particularly inflammatory social media post went viral, accusing Henry of ruining a young woman's life for his own gain. Henry's team monitored the backlash carefully, but Henry remained unfazed. People will believe what they want, he said. The truth is on our side. A week later, Henry received an unexpected call. It was Marcus, the whistleblower who had shared the emails with the press. Mr. Carter, I thought you should know, Marcus said, his voice low. I've been contacted by someone claiming to be an internal investigator for the airline. They're asking a lot of questions about you, like they're trying to dig up dirt. Henry's stomach tightened. Did they threaten you? No, but it felt off, Marcus said. I thought you should be aware. Henry thanked Marcus and hung up, his mind racing. The airline had agreed to reforms, but this new development suggested that some within the company weren't ready to change. He turned to Amanda and Elijah, who had been in the room during the call. They're playing dirty, he said. And if they think I'm going to back down, they've underestimated me. Elijah nodded. We'll be ready. If they're digging for dirt, we'll make sure they only find a mountain of evidence against themselves. Henry stared out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. The fight was far from over, but he was more determined than ever to see it through. The next morning, Henry's phone buzzed with another alert. This time, it wasn't just news. It was a direct escalation. A tabloid had published an article with the headline, "Who is Henry Carter?" Shocking allegations surfaced about the businessman fighting the airline. The piece was a clear hit job. It dredged up old, irrelevant details about Henry's past, twisting them into a narrative that portrayed him as aggressive and self-serving. The article even included an anonymous source claiming Henry had bullied colleagues in his early career, a blatant fabrication. Amanda stormed into Henry's office, phone in hand. This is a coordinated smear campaign, she said, placing her phone on the desk. It's too convenient. The timing, the angle, it's all designed to discredit you. Henry scanned the article, his jaw tightening. This has Dempsey written all over it, he said. He's losing his grip and trying to claw back control. Elijah entered the room holding a file. Henry, we expected this. They're trying to weaken your position by attacking your character. But we have an opportunity here. How so? Henry asked. Marcus' emails, Elijah said, placing the file on the desk. One of them explicitly mentions Mark Dempsey's direct involvement in suppressing complaints about Samantha. If we release this strategically, it not only takes the heat off you, but also forces the airline to distance itself from Dempsey. Henry considered this for a moment. If we release it now, they'll claim it's a retaliatory move. We need to time it perfectly. When they make their next move, we'll counter with this." Amanda nodded. "In the meantime, we need to address the smear campaign head-on. Should I set up another press conference?" Henry shook his head. "Not yet. Let's keep this contained for now. I'll respond directly through my platform. I want to control the narrative." Later that day, Henry posted a video to his social media accounts. Seated in his office with the city skyline behind him, he addressed the allegations with calm confidence. "I'm aware of the false stories being circulated about me," he began. "Let me be clear. These attempts to distract from the real issues will not deter me. This isn't about me. It's about accountability and justice. I've dedicated my life to building businesses and creating opportunities for others, and I won't let baseless attacks derail the fight for change." The video quickly gained traction, with thousands of likes, shares, and supportive comments pouring in. Public figures who had backed Henry before doubled down on their support, calling out the smear campaign for what it was. But the fight was far from over. The next day, Marcus called again, his voice tense. "Henry, I just got another call, this time from someone higher up. They didn't ask questions, they made threats. They said if I don't retract my statements, they'll sue me for breach of the NDA." Henry's grip on the phone tightened. "Marcus, listen to me. They're bluffing. They know that if they take you to court, all of this becomes public. That's the last thing they want." Marcus hesitated. "What if they're serious? I can't afford to fight them." "You won't have to," Henry assured him. "Elijah and I will handle it. But if we're going to protect you, I need you to stay strong. Can you do that?" After a long pause, Marcus finally said, "Yeah, I'll hold the line." As soon as the call ended, Henry turned to Elijah. "They're targeting Marcus because they see him as the weak link. We need to move quickly." Elijah nodded. "I'll file a preemptive motion to protect him. We can argue that their threats are retaliatory and meant to silence a whistleblower." The next escalation came from an unexpected direction. Late that evening, Henry received a call from Lisa, the senior flight attendant who had spoken at the press conference. "Henry," Lisa said, her voice shaking, "I think I'm being followed." "What?" Henry said, alarmed. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Lisa said. "There was a car parked outside my house last night, and I saw the same car following me today. I don't know what to do." "Stay calm," Henry said. "Where are you now?" "I'm at home," Lisa replied. "I'm sending security to your house," Henry said. "They'll stay with you until we figure out what's going on." "Thank you," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what I'd do without your support." After hanging up, Henry immediately called Amanda. "Get a private security team to Lisa's house tonight. I don't care what it costs. Just make sure she's safe." The following morning, Elijah walked into Henry's office with a grim expression. "Henry, we need to talk." "What is it?" Henry asked. Elijah handed him a printed document. It's a leaked memo from the airline's legal team. It outlines a strategy to discredit every whistleblower involved in this case, including Lisa and Marcus. They're not just playing dirty. They're going nuclear. Henry read the memo, his anger simmering. "They're willing to destroy lives to protect their image." Elijah nodded. "It's time to strike back. We need to release those emails now." Henry took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing on him. "Do it. But make sure it's clear that this isn't about revenge. It's about the truth." That afternoon, Henry's legal team released the emails to the media. The documents were damning, showing explicit efforts by Mark Dempsey and other executives to suppress complaints and protect Samantha. The public response was immediate and explosive. News outlets ran headlines like, "Airline execs caught covering up racial discrimination and Henry Carter vindicated." Leaked emails exposed corruption. Social media erupted with outrage, demanding not only Dempsey's resignation but a complete overhaul of the airline's leadership. As Henry watched the news coverage, Amanda walked into his office with a smile. "They're done," she said. "There's no coming back from this." Henry nodded, though his expression remained serious. "We've won this battle, but the war isn't over. Until real change happens, we can't let up." The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Henry felt the tide turning in his favor. The leaked emails sent shockwaves through the media, corporate offices, and the public at large. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within hours, Mark Dempsey's name became synonymous with corporate corruption, and calls for his resignation echoed across social media and in major news outlets. Meanwhile, the airline's stock plunged further, investors pulling out in droves as the company's reputation crumbled. Despite the victory, Henry knew this was only a step in the right direction. His phone buzzed relentlessly with interview requests, legal updates, and messages of support. But one call caught his attention. It was from William Grayson, the airline CEO. Henry answered, keeping his tone neutral. "Mr. Grayson, I assume this isn't a courtesy call." Grayson's voice was tense. "Mr. Carter, I think it's time we have another conversation. A private one. This situation is escalating beyond anyone's control." Henry leaned back in his chair. "That's what happens when the truth comes out, Mr. Grayson. What exactly are you proposing?" Grayson hesitated. "A meeting. Just you and me. We need to discuss how we can put an end to this before it destroys the company." Henry thought for a moment. "I'll agree to meet, but only if it's on my terms. No distractions, no intermediaries, just the two of us." "Agreed," Grayson said quickly. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. at your office." "I'll be here," Henry said before hanging up. He stared at the phone for a moment, wondering what Grayson was planning. The next morning, Grayson arrived at Henry's office promptly at 10 a.m., his polished exterior showing signs of strain. He extended a hand, but Henry ignored it, motioning for him to sit. The tension in the room was palpable as the two men faced each other. "Mr. Carter," Grayson began, his voice measured, "I want to start by apologizing. What happened on that flight, and everything that has happened since, was unacceptable." "I don't need apologies," Henry said sharply. "I need accountability in action." Grayson nodded. "That's exactly why I'm here. The board is in chaos, the public is demanding blood, and Dempsey is refusing to step down. The truth is, this company can't move forward while he's still in power." "Then remove him," Henry said bluntly. "It's not that simple," Grayson said, his tone lowering. "Dempsey holds significant sway within the board. For years, he's protected certain members in exchange for their loyalty. If I push too hard, they'll turn on me." Henry leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "So you're telling me the CEO of one of the largest airlines in the world is powerless against a man who's been exposed as corrupt?" Grayson hesitated, then sighed. "I need your help, Mr. Carter." Henry blinked, surprised by the admission. "Help? You want my help to clean up your mess?" "Yes," Grayson said, desperation creeping into his voice. "If you publicly back the company's reforms and support my leadership, it will give me the leverage I need to force Dempsey out." Henry stared at him, his mind racing. This was a risky proposition. Aligning himself too closely with the airline could backfire, especially if the reforms were superficial. But if Grayson was genuine, this could be a chance to enact real change. "And what guarantees do I have that you'll follow through?" Henry asked. Grayson reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "This is a draft proposal for the reforms we discussed: independent oversight, a whistleblower protection program, mandatory diversity training, and a public commitment to transparency. I'm willing to implement all of it, but I need your support to make it happen." Henry flipped through the documents, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "I'll consider it, but make no mistake, if you fail to deliver, I'll make sure this company burns to the ground." Grayson nodded solemnly. "Understood." After Grayson left, Henry gathered his team to discuss the proposal. Amanda, as always, was skeptical. "You really think he'll follow through?" she asked. "He's desperate," Henry replied. "Desperate people are capable of anything. But this isn't about trusting Grayson. It's about using this moment to force real change." Elijah chimed in. "The proposal is solid, but it's just words on paper for now. If you align with him, you'll need a seat at the table to ensure these reforms are implemented." Henry nodded. "Agreed. Let's draft a counterproposal. I want every commitment legally binding with timelines and penalties for noncompliance." Amanda smiled. "Now that's the Henry Carter I know." The following week was a whirlwind of negotiations. Henry's legal team worked tirelessly to refine the agreement, ensuring it left no room for loopholes. Meanwhile, the media continued to cover every twist and turn, painting Henry as a crusader for justice. Finally, the day came to announce the agreement. Henry stood alongside Grayson at a press conference, the tension between them barely masked by their outward professionalism. Grayson began with a prepared statement. "Today, we take the first step toward rebuilding trust with our passengers, employees, and the public. Under Mr. Carter's guidance, we are implementing sweeping reforms to ensure that incidents like this never happen again." Henry took the podium next, his presence commanding as ever. "This agreement is not the end of the fight. It's the beginning. Real change doesn't come from words, it comes from actions. I will personally ensure that every commitment made here today is fulfilled, and I encourage the public to hold us accountable." The crowd erupted in applause, but Henry knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. That evening, as Henry watched the press conference coverage on TV, his phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Marcus, thank you for not giving up. Because of you, people like me finally have hope." Henry smiled faintly, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. But as he put the phone down, another thought crept into his mind. Dempsey wasn't done yet. The fight wasn't over, and Henry was ready for whatever came next. Henry sat at his desk, reviewing the finalized reform agreement. The ink was barely dry, yet something gnawed at him. Mark Dempsey's silence in the days since the press conference was unnerving. Dempsey was a man who thrived on control, and the idea that he'd quietly accept his downfall didn't sit right. Amanda knocked lightly and entered, a folder in her hands. "You're not going to like this," she said, placing the folder on his desk. Henry opened it and scanned the contents. His face hardened. It was a confidential memo from an insider Amanda had cultivated within the airline. The memo detailed a meeting Dempsey had held with several board members, proposing a counter-strategy to dismantle the reforms before they could take effect. "He's already undermining the agreement," Henry said, his voice sharp. "And the board is entertaining it." Amanda nodded. The memo doesn't give specifics, but it suggests they're planning to use their influence to delay the implementation of the reforms, possibly indefinitely. Henry clenched his fists. Grayson either doesn't know, or he's turning a blind eye. Amanda hesitated. "There's more. Dempsey's pushing to make this about you. He's telling the board that the public will lose interest in the story soon, and when that happens, they can pivot the narrative to paint you as the aggressor who forced the company into unnecessary concessions." Henry's lips pressed into a thin line. He's betting on the public's short attention span, but he's wrong. We're not giving him the chance to recover. That evening, Henry met with Elijah to discuss the memo. They sat in Elijah's office, surrounded by stacks of documents and legal drafts. "This changes things," Henry said. "If Dempsey's actively working to sabotage the agreement, we need to preempt him." Elijah nodded. "We have two options. Escalate this legally or take it back to the court of public opinion. Both come with risks." "What's the legal angle?" Henry asked. "We can file an injunction to force the airline to implement the reforms on the original timeline. But it'll take time, and the board will fight it every step of the way." Henry leaned back in his chair, considering the alternatives. "And the public opinion route?" "We leak Dempsey's interference. Make it clear that he's the one standing in the way of progress. The public backlash will put pressure on the board to remove him." Henry's gaze sharpened. "Let's do both. File the injunction, but don't make it public yet. Meanwhile, I'll take care of the narrative." The next day, Henry's team released a carefully crafted statement to the media. It highlighted the ongoing efforts to implement reforms, but subtly pointed to resistance from certain factions within the airline. While it didn't name Dempsey outright, It left little doubt as to who was behind the resistance. Within hours, the story was trending. News outlets speculated about Dempsey's role, and social media erupted with calls for his resignation. Hashtags like #DismantleDempsey and #NoMoreExcuses began circulating widely. The pressure mounted quickly. By evening, a news segment aired featuring an interview with a former board member who, emboldened by the leaks, spoke openly about Dempsey's influence and history of suppressing dissent within the company. Dempsey, as expected, retaliated. He released his own statement, claiming the accusations were baseless and accusing Henry of orchestrating a campaign of hostility against the airline. It was a desperate move, but it was enough to create confusion among the public. The following week, Henry's legal team filed the injunction, catching Dempsey and the board off guard. The filing detailed their attempts to stall the reforms and included additional evidence provided by Marcus and Lisa. The case garnered widespread media attention, further isolating Dempsey from public support. The board, now under immense pressure, called an emergency meeting to discuss Dempsey's future. Henry was invited to attend, not as a participant, but as an observer, a move likely intended to intimidate him. Instead, it only strengthened his resolve. The meeting was held in a high-rise conference room with sweeping views of the city. Henry entered the room, his presence commanding. Dempsey was already seated, his expression a mask of forced calm, though his clenched jaw betrayed his frustration. The board chair, an older woman named Evelyn Foster, called the meeting to order. "We're here to address the growing concerns regarding Mr. Dempsey's leadership and the impact it's having on the company." Dempsey wasted no time defending himself. "This is a manufactured crisis," he said, his voice steady but cold. "We're being manipulated by external forces who have no stake in this company's success." Henry, though silent, locked eyes with Dempsey, his stare unwavering. Evelyn spoke next. "The evidence suggests otherwise, Mark. These delays in implementing the reforms are unacceptable. Our credibility is already in shambles, and your actions are only making things worse." Dempsey scoffed. "Are we really going to let a PR stunt dictate how we run this company?" Henry finally spoke, his tone measured but cutting. "This isn't about PR, Mr. Dempsey. This is about integrity. The public sees through your games, and so does everyone in this room." The room fell silent, the tension thick. Evelyn cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter is right. The longer this drags on, the more damage we incur. We need to act decisively." Dempsey looked around the room, searching for allies. For the first time, he realized how isolated he had become. Evelyn motioned to the board members. "We'll take a vote. All those in favor of removing Mr. Dempsey from his position, raise your hand." One by one, hands went up around the table. Dempsey's face turned red as the reality of his defeat sank in. By the time the final hand was raised, the vote was unanimous. "It's decided," Evelyn said. "Mark Dempsey is hereby removed from his position, effective immediately." Henry stood, his expression unreadable. "This is a step in the right direction," he said. "But it's only the beginning." As he left the conference room, he knew the real work was just beginning. With Dempsey gone, the road to reform was clearer, but the fight for accountability and systemic change was far from over. Henry was prepared to see it through, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. The news of Mark Dempsey's removal spread like wildfire. Headlines across major outlets proclaimed the victory as a turning point in corporate accountability, with Henry Carter hailed as the catalyst. However, for Henry, the removal of one man was just the beginning of a much larger mission. The systemic issues within the airline and the broader industry were still deeply entrenched. Henry's phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. "Amanda, Grayson wants to meet. Says he has an idea to move things forward." Henry frowned, wondering what angle Grayson was working now. He replied quickly, setting a time for later that afternoon. If Grayson truly wanted progress, Henry was willing to hear him out. Grayson arrived at Henry's office looking visibly more relaxed than during their previous encounters. The removal of Dempsey had lifted a weight off his shoulders, But Henry wasn't convinced the CEO was entirely on his side. "Mr. Carter," Grayson began, taking a seat across from Henry. "First, I want to thank you. Dempsey's removal wouldn't have been possible without your persistence." "I didn't do it for you," Henry said plainly. "I did it for everyone who's been harmed by this company's negligence." Grayson nodded, his tone turning more serious. "I understand. And I'm here because I believe we have an opportunity to set a new standard, not just for this airline, but for the industry as a whole." Henry leaned back in his chair, studying Grayson. "I'm listening." "I want to propose a partnership," Grayson said. "You'd serve as an external advisor to oversee the implementation of the reforms we've agreed to. Your presence would send a clear message that we're committed to change, and your input would ensure we stay on track." Henry raised an eyebrow. "You're asking me to become part of the very system I've been fighting against." "I'm asking you to help fix it from the inside," Grayson countered. "You've proven you're capable of holding us accountable. Now I'm giving you the authority to do it." Henry considered the proposal. On one hand, it could be a powerful platform to drive meaningful change. On the other, it risked associating him too closely with a company still mired in public distrust. "I'll consider it," Henry said finally. "But only if this partnership comes with complete transparency. I won't be a figurehead for PR purposes. If I find any resistance, I'll call it out publicly." Grayson nodded. "Agreed." As the partnership was announced, it drew mixed reactions. Supporters praised Henry for taking a proactive role in driving change, while skeptics questioned whether he could maintain his integrity while working with the airline. Henry knew the scrutiny would be intense, but he welcomed it. Transparency was the cornerstone of his approach, and he intended to uphold it. The first major step came with the formation of the Independent Oversight Committee. Henry personally selected members, ensuring they represented diverse perspectives, including employees, industry experts, and civil rights advocates. The committee's mission was clear: to identify systemic issues, recommend actionable solutions, and monitor their implementation. One of the first hearings was held to address employee grievances. Marcus and Lisa were among those who testified, sharing their experiences of retaliation and cover-ups. The stories were raw and damning, painting a vivid picture of the toxic culture that had festered under Dempsey's leadership. "I reported Samantha's behavior 3 times, Marcus said during his testimony. "Each time I was told to focus on my work or stop making waves. I was punished for speaking up while she was protected." Lisa added, as a senior flight attendant, "I was told to enforce policies that I knew were discriminatory. I stayed silent for too long, and I regret that deeply. But now I'm here to make things right." The hearing drew national attention, sparking conversations about accountability in corporate America. Henry, who presided over the hearing, ensured that every voice was heard and documented. While progress was being made, the backlash from certain factions was relentless. A small but vocal group of former Dempsey allies within the airline began spreading rumors that the reforms were weakening the company. Anonymous leaks to the media painted Henry as a power-hungry activist whose actions were allegedly harming morale. Henry addressed the criticism head-on in an interview with a prominent journalist. "Change is uncomfortable," he said. "For too long, people like Mark Dempsey thrived in environments where silence and complicity were rewarded. We're dismantling that system, and yes, it's going to ruffle feathers. But discomfort is a small price to pay for progress." The interview resonated widely, further solidifying Henry's reputation as a principled leader. One evening, as Henry reviewed a draft report from the Oversight Committee, Amanda burst into his office, her face pale. "You need to see this," she said, handing him her phone. Henry read the headline, "Whistleblower Targeted in Apparent Retaliation Attempt." The article detailed how Marcus's car had been vandalized and threatening messages left on his doorstep. Henry's heart sank. "Is he okay?" he asked. "He's shaken but unharmed," Amanda said. "He's asking for guidance on what to do." Henry stood, his resolve hardening. "We're not letting this slide. Notify the committee and reach out to law enforcement. I want Marcus protected." Amanda nodded. Already done. And Marcus said he's willing to go public about the threats. Henry exhaled, a mix of anger and admiration. He's braver than most. Let's make sure his story is heard. The next day, Marcus appeared in a televised interview, flanked by his legal counsel and Henry. He recounted the threats and made an impassioned plea for accountability. I came forward because I believed in the possibility of change, Marcus said. But this proves that some people are still trying to cling to the old ways. We can't let them win. The interview sparked outrage, with many calling for stricter protections for whistleblowers. The airline, now under even greater pressure, issued a statement condemning the retaliation and promising to cooperate fully with the investigation. As the weeks passed, Henry's efforts began to bear fruit. The reforms were gradually implemented and the airline's culture started to shift. Employees reported feeling safer and more valued, and the Independent Oversight Committee gained credibility as a model for other industries. But Henry knew the fight wasn't over. The forces of resistance hadn't disappeared. They were simply regrouping, and with every step forward, the stakes grew higher. Late one night, as Henry sat in his office, a notification popped up on his phone. It was an anonymous email with a single line. "You've made enemies, Mr. Carter. Be careful." Henry stared at the message, his jaw tightening. The threats were growing bolder, but he refused to back down. He had come too far, and the lives impacted by his work were too important to turn back now. The storm was far from over, but Henry Carter was ready for whatever came next. Henry woke up the next morning to another flurry of messages and updates from his team. The anonymous email from the night before lingered in his mind, but he refused to let fear dictate his next steps. As he sipped his coffee, Amanda called, her voice unusually tense. "Henry, there's something you need to see," she said. "A new leak. It's bad." "What is it this time?" Henry asked, his tone calm but wary. Amanda sighed. "Someone leaked internal emails from the airline suggesting that the reforms you're overseeing are driving up costs significantly. They're spinning it as you being reckless and financially irresponsible." Henry frowned. "Let me guess, this is being framed as my activism hurting the company." "Exactly," Amanda replied. "And Dempsey's allies are using it to stoke dissent among employees. Some are starting to question whether the changes are worth it." Henry leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully. This is their play. They're trying to turn the workforce against me by blaming reform for the airline's struggles. Amanda hesitated. "It's working, Henry. Employee forums are blowing up with complaints about layoffs and budget cuts. If we don't address this fast, it could unravel everything." Henry nodded. "Get the Oversight Committee together. We're going to fight this with facts." Later that day, the Oversight Committee convened for an emergency meeting. Henry sat at the head of the table, flanked by Amanda, Elijah, Lisa, and Marcus. The leaked emails were projected on a screen, their implications clear. "These claims are deliberately misleading," Elijah said. "Yes, there have been cost increases, but they're the result of overdue changes, not recklessness. The airline's previous leadership ignored problems for years, and now they're trying to pin the fallout on you." Marcus spoke up. "Employees are scared, though. They're seeing layoffs and budget cuts and assuming the worst. We need to show them the truth." Henry nodded. "Transparency is key. We'll release a detailed breakdown of where the money is going and how these reforms are improving the company long-term." Amanda frowned. "That might not be enough. People don't trust numbers. They trust stories. We need testimonials from employees who've benefited from the changes." Lisa chimed in. "I can help with that. I've seen firsthand how morale has improved among the flight crews. If we highlight those stories, it could counter the negativity." Henry tapped his fingers on the table, thinking, "Let's do both. Release the financial data and the testimonials simultaneously. We'll show the workforce and the public that these reforms are worth the investment." Over the next few days, Henry's team worked tirelessly to execute the plan. They compiled reports, collected testimonials, and produced a video featuring employees sharing their positive experiences since the reforms began. One testimonial came from a young flight attendant named Rachel. In the video, she described how the changes had given her the courage to speak up against unfair treatment. "Before, I was afraid of retaliation if I said anything," Rachel said. "Now, I feel like my voice matters. I've seen a real shift in how we're treated, and it gives me hope for the future." The video was released alongside a public statement from Henry and the Oversight Committee. It was clear, concise, and unapologetic. "Change comes at a cost," the statement read, "but the cost of doing nothing is far greater. These reforms are an investment in the future of this airline and its people. We won't allow fear and misinformation to derail progress." The campaign gained traction quickly, with employees and supporters rallying behind Henry. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #ProgressNotFear and #TrustToChange.